I grew up in Dedham, just across 128.
Okay. That's what Westwood used to be a part of until 1897.
Yep. Smart move.
Yep. But we don't have a town green like Dedham does.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. That's just the town the town grant, right? Well, Dedham, I guess, extended to the Rhode Island border at one time.
Wow.
Yeah, contentment. And the Fairbanks house, the oldest wooden frame house, 1636.
We had a program on that recently.
Did they talk about Jason Fairbanks and what he did?
I actually was away during that, so I wasn't on that.
Was Jason the murderer?
Correct.
Yeah, that was juicy.
Yeah. Poor girl.
Yeah, it's horrible.
And the parents actually sheltered him, and he convalesced at their home. And his escape up north. I do a lot of kayaking, and the Bridge Street Bridge, I told that story from my kayak on Facebook Live last summer.
Cool.
Yeah. I love history, anything. And we're in so much history. In understanding the Native American roots, to me, has been...
Do you know the history of Old Deerfield?
The Deerfield Raid, 1704?
When
Yes.
the Indians dragged people out of their houses and made them walk in the snow up to Canada.
That's correct. Not Elizabeth Hutchinson. I should know. Mary Hutchinson. Mary. Oh, she wrote a book.
I grew up near there, and I got married at the Deerfield Inn at the chapel next to it. And
Wow.
up in there, but I've always loved Deerfield Inn.
Yeah.
Old Deerfield.
The Deerfield Raid. I've done an extensive study on King Philip's War, but people don't know about what is it called Queen Anne's War, which took place during that time in New England. Of course, it was appropriating land from the Native Americans, and cheating and swindling them out of their resources. It's amazing, though, 400 years after the Great Dying in Plymouth from 1616 to 1619, the Narragansett Indians, or Native Americans, they social distanced from the Wampanoag. They went into the interior of Rhode Island, to western Rhode Island, to avoid the plague. But my theory is that there were two epicenters of the smallpox epidemic, if that's what it was. One emanated from northern Maine, and the other one was part of John Smith's fleet, that I believe the ground zero was Patuxent, Plymouth. Just my theory. A lot of people are looking at it.
So I think I've let everybody in who's in the waiting room, Marilyn. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Marilyn Friedman, co-president of Westwood Historical Society. We're bringing you this presentation tonight in conjunction with the Westwood Public Library. And tonight, our speaker is John Horrigan, who's a 5-time Boston, New England Emmy Award-winner and 20-time nominee for his role and host and writer of the cable TV program, The Folklorist. He narrated 2 popular films, Bridgewater Triangle, documentary about an alleged anomalous area in southeastern Massachusetts, and Lions of the East, a film about mountain lion encounters in New England. He's also a voiceover artist, actor, and a professional historical lecturer who has over 100 titles in his lecture portfolio. Tonight, John is going to he's going to share the story of the Knox Expedition and the British Evacuation of Boston with us. Specifically, he's going to talk about Henry Knox moving 59 cannons 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston by sled, oxen, and wagons so that the artillery was mounted atop Dorchester Heights by early March. However, March 17, 1776, the British decided to abandon their hold on Boston and left the city, hence Boston's celebration of Evacuation Day. I give you John Horrigan.
Thank you, Marilyn. What a wonderful introduction. It almost sounds like I wrote it.
You did.
Anyways, as Marilyn said, it's great to be here. I was lucky to host a show called The Folklorist. You can find it if you go to the URL www.folklorist.tv. We did many episodes, many segments, historical stories from my childhood. If you hear yelping in the background, that's my cat, Jacob. and he's been fed. Anyways, lucky to have 13 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and we went back-to-back nationally, New TV, out of Newton, Mass, in 2015, 2016 for Arts and Entertainment. But I'd like to say it was a critically acclaimed show that nobody was watching, but it was a good run. I belong to several historical societies, including the Society in Dedham for the Apprehension of Horse Thieves. In over 200 years, they have never apprehended a horse thief, but they have a wonderful annual dinner. So Henry Knox, as you can see, a portly guy, but a brilliant strategist, so well read in artillery, and he had one of the most daring military expeditions, I think, in the history of the United States, including D-Day. He was born in 1750, seventh of 10 children to William and Mary, but he had a weight problem throughout his entire life. And he became a bookseller, very well read in artillery, and he was a member of the Boston Grenadier Corps in 1771, and they still get together and have a wild parade in Boston every year. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand while hunting in the year 1773, and I have to be slow on this. He married Lucy Flucker in 1774. His bookstore, though, was looted by the British after conquered April 19, 1775. As you know, the British were pushed on a run back into Boston, and they occupied the Shawmut Peninsula, and Henry lost his bookstore, and he had to move with his family out to Western Mass, to Worcester, along with his wife Lucy and the brother William, who I'll talk about in just a moment. He participated in the Battle of Bunker Hill, June of 1775, and that plays into our story, and he was a very good friend of General George Washington. He greeted him as he arrived in Cambridge July 1st or July 2nd, 1775, depending upon which historian you speak about. So there he is, Henry Knox. When we're talking about Bunker Hill, the red circle there, that's the Heights in Boston. I do a lecture about that as well. But we're talking about Dorchester Heights here. So he or she who commands the Heights commands Boston Harbor. And as you can see, Boston was just a peninsula. It was later filled in as Back Bay. But the British had Boston quarantined, shut off. But the problem was they had basically locked themselves on, and they were surrounded on the Boston Peninsula, the Shawmut Peninsula. There you can see it again. So they had nowhere to go. And there were 3 peaks of Boston. That's why it's called Trimount. And I actually last summer stood on where the 3 peaks were. And one of them was just adjacent to a dumpster near a 7-Eleven. But anyway, so as I said, it was called Trimount, Mount Vernon, Beacon Hill, and Pemberton Hill. And 2 other hills the settlers later called Copp's Hill and Fort Hill. But we're so lucky. That's what Boston would have looked like at the time of Blackmount's arrival in the year 1628, circa 1629. You can see the hills of Boston. Of course, they were leveled, and including Beacon Hill, and the soil was used to fill in Back Bay. And this is actually the leveling of Beacon Hill. But here you can I'll show you all the fill-in of Back Bay from the Fenway through East Boston to the present. It's a city that's built on landfill, and of course, not only did they take the soil from these 3 major hills in Boston, but also the Great Boston Fire of November 9th, 1872. They used the debris and built upon it. The great book, by the way, my friend Stephanie Chereau on the Great Boston Fire of 1872, Damrell's Fire. But you can just see how it filled out from West Cove through Mill Pond, South Cove, East Cove. I always like this one. It just shows you how Boston developed. So South Boston, which is still being expanded as we speak. Anyways, Boston proper was 487 acres originally, Copp's Hill, etc. But this is the time of our story today, 1775 through 1776. This is what Boston would have looked like. Again, I just love the build-out of Boston, the history of the city. We're so rich in history, and I'm sure that a lot of you are historians. That's why you're attending this talk tonight. So again, you can do a lecture on all of this as well, but you can just see where it is. Anyways, those are the hills. So, Boston. This is the Siege of Boston. The British came in. There was rabble-rousing after the Stamp Act. The protest, and then the Boston Tea Party of 1773. British came in, they occupied Boston. You can see them in the lighter squares, but they were surrounded by angry colonists. So they literally could not leave the peninsula, and their supply line was a tether 3,000 miles to the east back to Great Britain. So they're on there. And then, of course, the Battle of Bunker Hill took place in June of 1775. So our story now is late November 1775. So the British, they actually trapped themselves in the port of Boston in the autumn of 1775, but the colonists lacked siege guns and stormtroopers to move them out. And artillery, if they could get artillery on Bunker Hill, they tried that and they failed. Or on Dorchester Heights, they could threaten and rain down cannonballs on British ships. So Henry Knox volunteers his expertise to General Artemas Ward, and he was commissioned as a colonel by George Washington earlier that year. In July of 1775, and Knox suggested to Washington, hey, what if we went up to Fort Ticonderoga, which was taken by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen in May 1775, and they took all the cannons out, and we'll talk about the number of cannons, to Boston by sledge, dragging them, by wagon, by boat, and mounted them atop Dorchester Heights. Well, just to comment on that, when it was taken by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont, Benedict Arnold wasn't even mentioned, and he was bitter for the rest of his life, and that's part of the reasons why he became a turncoat. But anyways, Knox was laughed at, and Washington said, have a laugh. No trouble or expense must be spared to obtain them. You're going to help them out. So this was an operation built on assumptions, and it worked. So Washington's faith in General Henry Knox ultimately led to the British abandoning Boston. And one of the great things of being a historian going into the Massachusetts Historical Society was actually reading the microfilm of the Henry Knox diaries. It's just magnificent. So the expedition, the plan was, according to Knox, was to move from Fort Ticonderoga, and I'll show you the map, down Lake George, down the west bank of the Hudson as far as Albany, then to cross the river and down the east bank as far as Kinderhook, from whence to turn due east to the Berkshires, through Great Barrington, Monterey, Otis, Blandford, Westfield, Springfield, and so to Cambridge. And the step off at Cambridge on horseback with his brother William took place on November 16th, 1775, and they went on a special mission for Washington to deliver some orders that were secured. William Knox is only 19 years old. Henry Knox at this time is 25 years old. The maturity that they showed, and the cunning, and the fearlessness. But anyways, they were looking also for reinforcements and sending a message down to Washington. But Knox, in order to pull this off, Henry Knox, desired unfrozen lakes, frozen rivers in some places, and snowpack, and then dry roads on the way to Boston. And as a weather historian, I could probably tell you from the day that the Pilgrims threw anchor in Provincetown Harbor to the present day, I could probably find a journal and give you the weather in Massachusetts, because they kept arduous weather accounts in their journals and diaries. So you'll see me reflecting based on the weather in William Ames's diary of that Dedham had a moderate snowy on the 21st. So there's the intended route, from Fort Ticonderoga, south through Albany, Clave Rock, over the Berkshires in Massachusetts, Springfield, Framingham, and on to Dorchester Heights. And this is the intended route. Here to the left, you can see again Fort Lake George in the left-hand corner, known as the Finger Lakes, beautiful region. And I've driven that, and they have markers everywhere, every dozen miles or so, and we'll look at some of those. And that's the way they were going to go, south through Stillwater, and all on assumptions, and then cross over into Massachusetts, all without being discovered by loyalists, because if word got back to Great Britain, and I'll speculate on that, it could have been chaos. But that's Fort Ticonderoga. I recommend, if you can ever visit it, do so, right on the edge of Lake Champlain. And it's a typical fort of the period. You can see that. Typical Fort Ticonderoga. So, again, as I mentioned, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, there really wasn't much of a fight. They came upon the fort, which was unarmed, and caught them unawares. In fact, you can see a gentleman in his dressing gown here, his dressing robe, and they basically said, give us the keys to the fort, and they took it over. This was lost. It was originally owned by the colonists. They lost it to the British, and then they took it back, and they'd eventually lose it back to the British. But they're commemorative stamps of the taking of Fort Ticonderoga. And there's just an image of it showing you in the snow and oil painting. So they had all sorts of guns and cannons, and the idea was to take the guns and cannons and howitzers, mortars, load them up on sleds, drag them by oxen south, again crossing over the Hudson River and the Mohawk River, and then again into Massachusetts. It was a pretty gutsy operation. So William Knox is going to be leading the cannon trade, but out ahead of him is his brother Henry. Henry's miles ahead of the expedition, and he's knocking on doors getting provisions for his mile-long cannon train, and he's also talking to the local burghers and leaders of the communities that they'll be passing through for bivouac, sleeping, food, etc., ropes, pulleys, and stuff like that. So on the 1st of December, via the Hudson River, he reports to General Philip Schuyler. He gets sled, rope, oxen, men, teamsters from New York, boats, and provisions. And Schuyler then was ordered by Washington to assist both Knox brothers with all of the facets of the operation, get the expedition to and from Fort Ticonderoga, and help transport the heavy ordnance across the Berkshires. Easier said than done. So the expeditionary force of all these men reached Fort George, which is on the southern end of Lake George, on the 3rd of December, and again they're riding on frozen, rutted roads. Imagine these dirt roads, they get wet and the wagons sink, and then they're rutted, kind of like our roads after we have a 68-degree day followed by a 30-degree day and rain. And then on the 5th of December, they're loading rafts and boats because they've got to take, and I'll show you the map, take the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, use portage overland, and dump them into Lake George, then sail down Lake George, again offload them onto sleds dragged by oxen. So we don't know the exact count of how many men accompanied the Knox expedition. I assume there's about nearly 150 by the time they get to Albany. And again, it's contingent upon the location of the train. And we do know that the rough guess is about 80 or 2 men for every yoke of oxen. Knox does mention in his diaries 43 yoke or 43 pair of oxen. So again, if you ever did these, it would take you a couple of days to see all these markers, but there's one at Fort Ticonderoga, marker number 1, as you can see on this map, and marker number 2. But they're at Fort Ticonderoga, and from December 5th through the 8th, again, portage to Lake George. Henry Knox is staying with the cannon train early on as they get it out of Fort Ticonderoga, go across land, and put them into boats and rafts in Lake George. So here's where we're starting, if you can see the red circle in the upper left-hand portion of this map. And it's going to take them about 3 days, almost 4 days, to get the ordnance, the cannons, and cannonballs from Fort Ticonderoga overland into Lake George. So again, there's Fort Ty. And this is what they look like today. But you can see they have to disassemble the cannons along with the carts that hold the cannons. And there are 3 types of artillery pieces: the cannon, the howitzer, and the mortar. Okay? And so the mortar is an indirect fire weapon that fires explosive projectiles known as mortar bombs at low velocities, short ranges, and high arcing ballistic trajectories. It's typically muzzle loading and has a barrel length less than 15 times its caliber. Now, a howitzer is a type of artillery piece characterized by a relatively short barrel and the use of comparatively small propellant charges to propel projectiles at relatively high trajectories with a steep angle of descent. The cannon is much longer range. It uses gunpowder or other usually explosive-based propellants to launch a projectile, like a cannonball. Sometimes the British would use hot shot, all right, which are incendiary cannonballs. That's what they used on the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775 to light Charlestown on fire. But anyways, these cannon vary in caliber, range, mobility, rate of fire, the angle of fire, and firepower. And different forms of cannon combine and balance these attributes in varying degrees. And so there are some large cannons, but the largest is a 24-pounder, which is the prize of the drag. That's the one with the longest range. And there are two 18-pounders as well. So these are the three pieces that Knox knew of, and these were the three main pieces of artillery that he wanted to wheel back to Boston. So there were 78 pieces of salvageable, ranging from a small 4-pound cannon to a 24-pounder. They took guns, mortars, howitzers, flints, and tons of muskets and cannonballs. They had really no cannon to speak of. Some of the cannon that they had were seized in the powder alarm of September 1st, 1774. Others were buried at Barrett's farm during the April 19th debacle with the British at Lexington and Concord. So they nicknamed one of these cannons the Independence, and the other one they nicknamed Liberty, one of the 18-pounders. Now, the John Adams, you might have seen a series years ago on HBO, wonderful series. Paul Giamatti, what an actor, was there. But they did not drag the cannons by Abigail Adams' house. No, didn't happen. But on December 6th, again, 1775, Fort Place d'Armes dock near King's Store, they load up out of Fort Ty 42 sleds with 16 brass and 26 iron cannon. These numbers come specifically from Knox's diaries. 8 brass mortars, 6 iron cohorns, 3 iron howitzers, 2,300 pounds of lead, and a barrel of flints. Now, how many did they say? We don't know. 59 is a total mention. McCullough says 58, David McCullough 55, 56, but I rely on Knox's diary, and we'll talk about that at the conclusion of my talk. But there are 3 types of boats that they used: rowboats, small sailboats called a scow, a bateau, and a petty auger. And so it takes 3 days to move all of the cannon, 60 tons worth, from Fort Ticonderoga to the north shore of Lake George. Again, they have to drag it over land to get to the next lake. And again, William's only 19, and he's in charge of the heavy elements, and he rode ahead, Henry rode ahead to stage the necessary engineering tasks. Got to get horses, oxen, sleds, secure billets where the men going to sleep, provisions, food, and then finalize the routes. So again, they're doing this on assumptions. And again, they're foraging at Fort Ticonderoga. That's marker number 1 right there. I don't know if you've been to Watertown, Framingham, Weston. You can see these markers. There's one right in front of the Watertown Library. But I guess that's the reason why I got into that, because 20 years ago when I lived across from the library, there was the marker. So Knox's diary entry, and we're going to refer to this on December 6th, reads, quote, employed in getting the cannon from the fort on board a gondola, that's a boat, in order to get them to the bridge. Once loaded, the gondola was sailed or rowed around the peninsula of Ticonderoga into the river Lachute, then about a half-mile up to the bridge that carried the portage road across the river just below the lower falls. This was the head of navigation from Lake Champlain, and here the cannon were unloaded off the gondola while it returned for another load. And you'll see a weather reference in red below, cold and above freezing. Again, a marker. This is the second marker just outside of Fort Ty. So, December 7th, he says, employed in getting the cannon from the bridge to the landing at Lake George. So they're debarking, and they're getting to Lake George by about December 7th or 8th. We know that there's a huge snowstorm in Quebec. At this time, Benedict Arnold is leading a futile expedition to attack the fort at Quebec. It was a tragedy. His men, half of them, abandoned the expedition as they lost their shoes. They had to eat their dogs. It was just a debacle that Arnold led this attack on Quebec. But there's a huge sunstorm. But we know Dedham had a little snow and it was sunny out. So Knox is supervising. William Knox is the 19-year-old is supervising the overland movement of the cannon down the Portage Road, and Henry takes off on his horse and goes ahead again to secure the route. And again, on the 8th, they say ditto on the mortars. So they've moved all of the ordnance that they're going to take back to Boston, 300 miles. They've moved it now to the northern end of Lake George. So here's where we are. We've gone from Fort Ti, right there, and they shove off, and they're going down Lake George. And in the diary, he talks about the Petty Auger and a bateau. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They go down the lake of the Petty Auger, and they've got smooth sailing, and the scow is coming after it, and about a mile ahead with a fair wind to go down. But the wind died away. With the utmost difficulty, they reached Sabbath Day Point at 9 o'clock in the evening, and they went halfway down Lake George, and they went to shore and warmed themselves by an exceeding good fire in a hut made by some civil Indians. Again, that's a politically incorrect term, but that's what he uses, who were with their ladies abed, and they gave us some venison, roasted after their manner, which was very relishing. So the natives in the area helped them out and fed the men. And you're going to see the Canadian weather accounts that I'm trying to combine here with British Lieutenant Caleb Haskell, and then Thomas Ansley and Captain Henry Dearborn and General Montgomery. So it's a combination. So again, they're moving down. There's a hazard in Lake George. William's diary. Now, William Knox, he wrote that, accordingly, I jumped into the boat and ordered my man to bring my baggage, and we would go with them. Accordingly, we set it out, being 11 o'clock, with a slight breeze ahead. The men rowed briskly, but we had not been out about an hour when the wind sprang up, very fresh and directly against us. The men, after rowing exceedingly hard for about 4 hours, seemed desirous of going ashore to make a fire to warm themselves, and I knowing them to be very exceedingly wary. So they hit a heavy wind, and they stopped the operation for the night, December 9th. December 10th at Bolton Landing, William, again, the 19-year-old who was with the expedition, we warmed ourselves sufficiently and took a comfortable nap, laying with our backs to the fire. The next morning they started again about a half an hour before daybreak. That is about a quarter after rising. We set out, and in 6 hours and a quarter of excessive hard pushing against a fresh breeze, we reached Fort George. So just showing you the map. This is marker number 6, Bolton Landing. Another view of Bolton Landing today. Nice little park. And this is what the plaques would read in New York. Through this place passed General Henry Knox in the winter of 1775-1776 to deliver to General George Washington in Cambridge the train of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga used to force the British Army to evacuate Boston. So Knox arrives just after noon. Henry's landfall at Fort George Village. Again, he's out in front making arrangements and preparations for all this ordnance and the men that are coming down the lake. And now it snows and there are cold temperatures. But again, he's hoping that the land carriage phase of the operation, that he gets frozen roads. The last thing he wants is to have muddy, ruddy roads. And moreover, he'd like a snow cover so he can pull them by sleds by oxen. So he's also checking now the ice in the Hudson River. The Hudson is a mighty river. The Charles River at its widest point in Boston towards the Science Museum across from MIT is nothing but a trickle compared to the Hudson. But he wanted to have solid ice because they had to cross over. And he wanted to take 18 pounds of weight of his largest gun, which was the 24-pounder. So he says, quote, on Monday the 11th, I sent an express to Squire Palmer of Stillwater to prepare a number of sleds and oxen to drag the cannon to be ready for the first snow. So again, they've just crossed down Fort George, blue circle there, and now they're beginning their journey south. They're going to be crisscrossing the Hudson River. And this is what the marker looks like at Fort George Village. And they're there at December 11th. So now they've gone down December 9th. You can see Henry is out ahead of the train. He's again in front. So the train lands on the 13th. And by the 11th, Henry's already gone down. So Henry's about a week ahead of the team at some points. Again, he's heading south to get out ahead of them to warn the villagers that this large expedition is coming. And then he writes to Palmer, Captain Palmer. He says, "Sir, I must beg that you would purchase or get made immediately 40 good strong sleds that will each be able to carry a long cannon clear from dragging on the ground, which will weigh 5,400 pounds each. And likewise, that you would procure oxen or horses as you shall judge most proper to drag them. I think that you may be able to purchase sleds that are already made by strengthening might do. The sleds that they are first put upon are to go to camp near Boston, the cattle as far as Albany or Kinderhook, where we must get fresh ones." Henry Knox. So that's how he's asking him for provisions. And then meanwhile, back on the lake, this is William now. He's saying, "On the 13th, being very uneasy at not hearing of our little fleet, we dispatched an express boat about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, received advice that on the morning of the 10th, the scow had gotten off the rock." And again, some of these boats, due to the wind, had been blown towards the shoreline where there are heavy rocks. And there was a lot of treachery. So one boat, exceedingly high, the sea had beat her in such a manner that she sunk. So what they had to do is recover the cannon and the mortar and the howitzers from the sunken boat and put them on another boat. So again, it's Sabbath Day Point. They reach on the 13th of December, William. And then the cannon finally arrives at Fort George on December 16th. And the diary says, "Received of Henry Knox $26, which Captain John Johnson paid to different carters for the use of their cattle in dragging cannon from the fort of Ticonderoga to the north landing of Lake George. William Brown, Jr., Lieutenant." And then Henry writes to General Schuyler, who knows about the operation. "Sir, we have been so fortunate as to get the mortars and cannons safely over the lake to this place. I arranged with Captain Palmer of Stillwater to get proper conveyances from them from here. We are apprehensive of a difficulty at Albany for want of a proper scow. I am not well enough acquainted with the road after we cross at the Half Moon to know whether it be practicable to keep on the east side of the river entirely to Kinderhook." Again, he doesn't know the route. "I expect Captain Palmer up with the teams on Tuesday or Wednesday, and I expect to move as far as Saratoga if the sledding continues as at present." So basically he's saying we're just waiting now on the sleds, on the oxen, on the ropes and pulleys. And they're now in what is today known as Glens Falls, and it's Christmas Eve, and they want to depart to Saratoga, but one problem: there's no snow on the ground for the sleds. They can't drag sleds across hard, rutted, frozen ground. And he now writes to Washington on December 17th. Could we have a mute there? Hello to all the dogs watching at home. "I have made 42 exceedingly strong sleds," he's writing to Washington, "and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them as far as Springfield." He really means 42 yoke. 80 oxen is what he's saying. "Where I shall get fresh cattle to carry them to camp. The route will be from here to Kinderhook, from whence into Great Barrington, Massachusetts Bay, that's the colony, and down to Springfield. There will scarcely be any possibility of carrying them from here to Albany or Kinderhook, but on sleds the roads being very gullied. At present, the sledding is tolerable to Saratoga, about 26 miles. Basically telling him his plan: oxen down along the banks of the Hudson and Mohawk, across the Hudson and Mohawk, across the Berkshires, and then at that point, once they cross the Berkshires, they'll cut over to horse and wagon. And now, be careful, they call it, spiking the football before everything's done. He's very confident. He says, "Beyond that, there is none. I have sent for sleds and teams to come here." He hasn't even gotten the sleds yet. "And expect to begin to move them to Saratoga on Wednesday or Thursday next, trusting that between this and then we shall have a fine fall of snow, which will enable us to proceed further and make the carriage easy." He's predicting snow, even though he doesn't know snow is coming. And then he says, "If that should be the case, I hope in 16 or 17 days to be able to present your excellency with a noble train of artillery, the inventory of which I have enclosed." And of course, he doesn't arrive in Dorchester till early March, so it took him twice as long. And you can see the pages of Knox's diary there. So they're ready to go to Saratoga. It's Christmas Eve. Knox has to go by foot to Fort Miller and then cross the Hudson. and they get heavy snow over 2 feet, but it's bitter cold. He gets the snow that he wanted and then some. In fact, there's 2 feet. It's a huge snowstorm. Dedham, Massachusetts, way to the east, gets 2 feet of snow as well. So Judge Dewar procured me a sleigh to go to Stillwater, he says in his diary. He crosses the Hudson by ferry to the west side, arrives at Saratoga and Schuylerville, and he stopped and had dinner. And he says that we dined and set off about 3 o'clock. It's still snowing exceeding fast. After the utmost efforts of the horses, we reached Ensign's Tavern 8 miles beyond Saratoga. We lodged. So the going is getting tough here, but he gets a meal. He's out ahead of it. He's in Saratoga. His men are still miles behind him, just getting off of Fort George. So again, by Christmas Day and the following day, the cannon train is ready, and this is a nice depiction. Just shows you it just goes back off and into the distance, and you can imagine what a spectacle this would be. And I'm sure it smelled pretty bad too, but to see the villagers who had never seen anything like that, a mile-long cannon train of oxen dragging these huge cannons and their wheels on sleds coming silently through a village. Amazing. So now it's Christmas Eve departure to Stillwater, and you can see they had to take the wheels off and drag them. They have a fresh snowfall. So Henry Knox awoke on Christmas Day, 2 feet of fresh snow on the ground. He's delighted. He goes to Stillwater to get another sled to go to Albany, but he notices that the roads not being broken prevented our getting farther than New City, which is modern-day Lansingburg, about 9 miles north of Albany, where we lodged. So it's a complex route, but I figured that the road to Albany at that time would have had him cross the Hudson to the east at Lansing's Ferry at Half Moon, pass through Lansingburg to what is now Troy, New York, then pass back to the west side of the Hudson at Schuyler Falls to reach Albany. And the Charles, as I said, is a trickle at its widest point when compared to the Hudson River. So again, to the east, cross over. You can see the red arrows, cross the Mohawk, and then cross over again to Albany. So very complex route. And again, they don't have boats at this point in time. They left them at Fort George at the southern end of Lake George. They're on sleds, so they need frozen rivers to get to Albany. And he says, in the morning we set out and got only 2 miles when our horses tired and refused to go any farther. This is Henry now. I was then obliged to undertake a fatiguing march of about 4 miles in snow, 3 feet deep through the woods. So you can imagine a 300-pound man, even though he's 25, walking 4 miles in the snow up to his waist, no beaten path. That's tiring. He got to Squire Fisher's. Again, he had a fine breakfast and provided me with horses, which crossed me as far as Colonel Schuyler's, where I got a sleigh to carry me to Albany. And he said, I almost perished with the cold. You can imagine. And by the way, Arnold right now is just floundering in Quebec. Again, here's a nice depiction of what this cannon train would have looked like as the men trotted slowly and silently, again, hoping not to be discovered by loyalists, which would give up their plan. So there's an arrival in Albany on the 26th. Everything's going according to schedule. Henry Knox says, General Schuyler sent out his wagon master and other people to all parts of the country to immediately send up their sleighs with horses suitable, allowing them 12 shillings per day for each pair of horses and oxen per ton for 62 miles. So the sled teams finally arrive at Fort George at the end of December, at the Lake George, and then they head southward towards Albany. Again, Henry is way out ahead of the expedition at this point, but as the men and his brother William arrive, the villagers are expecting them, and they're awaiting them there with places to sleep, food, hay for the oxen, and of course some good cider. But again, there are issues. Is the ice thick enough for this huge, heavy cannon train a mile long to cross over the Mohawk and the Hudson? So Knox was in Albany waiting for the train to catch up, and he even, to thicken the ice, it's an old trick if you had backyard hockey rinks, drill holes in the river water and then pour buckets of river water over the surface to freeze it. He's trying to get a thicker layer of ice on both the Mohawk and on the Hudson River because he doesn't think that it'll hold if the expedition tries to cross. This is a little drawing here just showing you as they come through the mountainous region. And again, this is by January 4th, the lead sleds of the noble train of artillery reached Albany. And again, their prize of the drag was the 24-pound cannon Independence. So by January 4th, they're in Albany, and the first guns cross the Hudson at Lansing's Ferry, and they arrive in Albany. And again, this is William's diary. Thursday the 4th arrived a brass 24-pounder and a small mortar. But, as I said, they never went to Braintree. So now, though, it's starting to warm up. Wind is blowing from the southwest. It's around freezing, hovering around 32 degrees. The ice begins to melt. Henry, at this point, writes another letter to George Washington. He calls him His Excellency. The want of snow detained us for some days, and now a cruel thaw hinders from crossing the Hudson River, which we are obliged to do 4 times from Lake George to this town. Again. So the first severe night will make the ice sufficiently strong. Till that happens, the cannon and mortars must remain where they are. These inevitable delays pain me exceedingly. They're stopped. They can't cross the river until it freezes over. So now he's hoping for cold weather to freeze the rivers up. And again, once the thickening ice permits the rest of the guns to get to Albany, he's hoping there's enough snow on the roads to get them easily to Springfield. And he predicts arrival there in 8 or 9 days after the first severe freeze. Again, this is no radar back then. There's no, Cindy Fitzgibbons pointed out a weather chart for you. They had to just guess by the wind. And that's one thing the colonists had an advantage over the British. They knew the weather. If the wind was blowing from the northwest, bitterly cold. From the southwest, a thaw. If it was blowing from the south, there was weather coming from the south. So then news happens that in the afternoon, by hearing that one of the heaviest cannon, one of the 18-pounders, had fallen through the ice into the river at half moon. The ice is too thin, so he says we're going to look for a better ford, a better crossing across the Mohawk. So they lose a cannon into the river. And he says, quote, at Slosses, as the ice was so much stronger there than at Half Moon, the usual place of crossing. So they find a stronger area, a more shallow area to ford the river. But this crossing is on the Mohawk, west of the Hudson, later known as Claus's Ferry, near Crescent, New York. So here's where we have trouble at Half Moon. They're heading south, they cross at Half Moon, south across the Mohawk, and now they're heading due east to Albany. So another cannon goes into the drink on January 7th. Knox attempts to move the cannon train eastward to the Hudson to Rensselaer. He says the cannon, which the night before last came over at Slosses Ferry, we attempted to get over the ferry here, which we effected accepting the last which fell into the river, notwithstanding the precautions we took. So nothing they could do. But the remainder of the cannon train now reaches Albany. They're moving. Diary. We went on the ice about 8 o'clock in the morning and proceeded so carefully that before night we got over 23 sleds, that's half the expedition, and were so lucky as to get the cannon out of the river owing to the assistance of the good people of Albany. Essentially every man, woman, and child in the village of Albany came and pulled on ropes to pull that cannon out of the river and effectively saving one of the prize pieces of artillery. So I always like to salute Albany. Here, here. Thank you for doing that. All right. So, again, they're making progress. An operation built on assumptions. And he's pulling it off. This is John Becker. He's a 12-year-old lad from Old Saratoga, and he actually had his own diary as well. And he served with his father as a driver for Knox on the trip from Fort George to Springfield, Mass. What they're going to do is once they get over the Berkshires, the New York Teamsters, which John Becker and his father are members, will separate, and the Massachusetts Teamsters will go east. And his first account didn't show up until the 1830s. when he was a relatively old man in his 67 years old, I guess, right? 1775, 12 years old, so 25, 55. Yeah, he was 67 years old. And this is what Becker, the young man, says. We felt an unusual degree of interest in fulfilling our contracts. My father took in charge of a heavy iron 9-pounder, which required the efforts of 4 horses to drag it along. Others had the heavy resistance of 18-pound, and 24s to overcome, which required the exertions of at least 8 horses. We had altogether all 40 or 50 pieces to transport, and our cavalcade was quite imposing. So at Lansing's Ferry near the mouth of the Mohawk, they crossed the ice, and as a precaution, a 40-foot rope was tied to the first sleigh tongue, and a teamster walked alongside with a hatchet, alongside the river, and he would cut the rope to save the horses should the heavy gun crash through the ice, because if the gun crashed through the ice, it would pull the horses in. And halfway across the ice, it gave way. A noble 18 sank with a crackling noise, and then a heavy plunge to the bottom of the stream. The water fortunately was shallow, the gun was recovered, but the crossing at that point of the river was abandoned. So they backtracked, they had to go back up north, and they finally crossed the Mohawk at Clouse's Ferry on thin ice, and they remained on the west side of the Hudson until Albany. And again, 1 cannon was lost in the Mohawk and left there. But within 3 days, the remainder of the guns had entered Albany for the final crossing of the Hudson. And Becker said, our appearance excited the attention of the burghers. Those are the leaders of the village. This was the first artillery which Congress had been able to call their own, and it led to reflections not in the least inferior to our cause. A lot of people were inspired by seeing this in Albany, like the Revolution. Yeah, get the British out of Boston. So you can see this is just a depiction of what it would look like through slush trying to get through the shallow portion of ford across the Mohawk and the Hudson. So now, January 9th, they're heading for Claverack. They're heading south still, and Knox rides ahead, and he says, I set out at about 12 o'clock and went as far as Claverack, about 9 miles beyond Kinderhook. Another broken sleigh detains him for 2 days, and that's one thing that Knox did, William Knox. They would not separate the train. If there was a breakdown of a sled or problem, the whole cannon train stops until they fix that problem. They traveled together, and that was key to the operation. So they're in Kinderhook, right? They want to get to Claverack, and that's where they turn east. It's January 10th. Now, there's been some discussion. Early historians determined that the route through Claverack was due south on the Post Road, and I've walked this and drove it myself, to the present village of Claverack and then east on Route 23 into Massachusetts. So the route that is the route marked by the Knox Trail monuments erected in 1927. But research done in the early 1970s suggests a more southeasterly route from Kinderhook toward the Massachusetts border above North Egremont and then on to Great Barrington. So in other words, you can see here Claverack, let's just look at it. They actually might have gone to the southeast. Okay? And that's how they cut, and they might have bypassed Claverack. Now, further investigation, Claverack was a haven of loyalists, and the last thing they wanted to do was pass by the cabin or the home of a loyalist, because they would somehow get the word back to Britain, back to the British in Boston. So that's what we think. Anyways, this is, you can see here, lower left-hand corner, in 1975, they said maybe the majority of the train, they bypassed most of Claverack. So now they took the hazardous military trail that was only used by a few others. It was a trapper's trail. And again, most of the main roads, I do a lecture on the old roads and trails in Massachusetts. Most of these were game trails by the natives in the area, and then fur trappers. Of course, the beaver by this time had been hunted to extinction in New England. And because there's so many people, especially in France and England, that wanted beaver pelts for hats and for shoes because they were waterproof, and for coats. Anyways, they head now on what's modern day Route 23 over the Berkshires is where they're heading. Great Barrington, Otis, and then on to Springfield. And again, as you said, he used 86 oxen in place of horses, 43 yokes. So now they're heading to Great Barrington and to the foothills of the Berkshires. And this is my favorite entry. This is where Henry Knox, a most prolific writer, he wrote volumes during the Revolution and after the Revolutionary War about artillery and accounts of the Revolution. But in the terms of Jack Bauer, 24, he goes dark after this entry. He says, quote, "We reached number 1, referring to Monterey, Massachusetts, after climbing mountains from which we might almost have seen all the kingdoms of the earth." And that's the end of the known Henry Knox diaries. And I think is that in case he was captured, he didn't want the British to find out where they were going, what their intentions were, how many. And he put those diaries, he rolled them up in a scroll and kept them in his pouch. So now they're going on assumptions, and this is a good depiction, trying to cross the Berkshires. And can you imagine hauling them up hills and then down hills, which is even more dangerous? And again, they're using weights, tackle, and pulley to get it, and they removed the wheels. But God bless those oxen. And they're heading east to Otis, and that's me, a much younger time, at a lighter weight, at east to Otis, at one of the markers there. So now, this is where the American Revolution might have been lost, in my opinion. They're into a 12-mile stretch, a treacherous stretch called Greenwoods, and it's dreary and forbidding. Dense evergreen forests, no trail, goes up this way, down this way, craggy rocks, up this way, down this way, and you're going to take a mile-long cannon train, oxen dragging sleds, and this is where the men were going to quit on him. No way, too dangerous. And this is where trouble awaited them. And now the descent of Glasgow, which is now modern-day Westfield, this Glasgow mountain had to be made, the final mountain, sheer cliffs down the hill. And this, in my opinion, was Henry Knox's finest hour. When men give up or refuse orders due to their own personal safety, fear, lack of faith and inspiration, this is the time when a leader must emerge. And this is the time, I believe, and again, where the men, getting hurt, falling down, cutting themselves, this is where, on a cold January day in 1776, January 12th, on the side of a mountain in the Berkshires, the entire American Revolution may have hung in abeyance, teetering on the brink of failure. And this artillery was required to end the siege of Boston by an oppressing occupier who looted and burned homes in Boston, assaulted colonial men, insulted their wives, and were indignant to their children. An army that was bankrolled by an imperialist king who sought to unfairly tax and brutally suppress a self-sustaining population 3,000 miles away. That's what was going on in Boston. That's what this was about. And you can see them calling out here, trying to move this camera. And now the men said, no, we're not going on any further. So for 3 hours, Henry Knox coaxed the men and assured these Hudson Valley, New York Teamsters that the treacherous trip downhill could be made without danger from runaway weighted sleds that may plummet downhill upon them. Now, he supervised the precautionary measures taken as drag chains, poles thrust under runners, check ropes, anchored to one tree after another. It was a brutal effort, frozen hands, frostbite. And this block and tackle idea came from Henry Knox, who consulted with his good friend John Glover from the Marbleheaders the past autumn. Now, Glover would be the one who would row Washington across the Delaware in the coming months. So, after this impassioned plea, I'm speculating that the foreman who represented the Teamsters stood up and said, we're with you, Colonel, and grab the ropes, my good men, and pull with your hearts, pull for your families, pull for your freedom from tyranny. And it's a key moment in the American Revolution, in my opinion. And it's revenge for Bunker Hill, too. It's revenge for them occupying Boston. It's revenge for the Stamp Act. So, here they are now. They've crossed the Berkshires, and they're moving east to Blandford. Okay? And again, as we know about marker number 5 in Blandford, That's where I stood there. But again, they're making headway. They've gotten over the worst part of the route. They're actually going to succeed. And the British haven't found out yet. And you can see there's another deviation here on Route 23. They called it General Knox's Road. So generally, people think the expedition was modern-day Route 90, parts of modern-day Route 9, and parts of modern-day Route 20. But here, they dipped to the southeast on a place called General Knox Road. And then they finally arrive in Westfield. Here's where they're so happy that even amongst the oldest inhabitants had never seen a cannon, and their mouths agape. And they were employed in remarking upon their guns, and while they were checking out the guns, all the men, the teamsters, were enjoying their cider and whiskey. And in that evening, Knox was surrounded. I guess there were 2 hours of speeches by the local. Everybody was an officer in the militia, and nobody was a militiaman. In fact, Knox said, "What a pity that our soldiers are not as numerous as our officers." What is it? Too many chiefs and not enough Indians? Again. So there's a huge party at Westfield. They did it. And now they're going to move to Springfield. This is where the New York guys get to go home to see their families, and the Massachusetts guys take over. And again, a brilliant operation. So they're in Springfield moving east, and now they got to cross the Connecticut River. Okay, now the ice held though, but on the far side, once they got across the Connecticut, which thankfully had frozen on January 16th, then, you know New England weather, right? We had 68 degrees Sunday. We're going to have snow here on a Tuesday night. It changes, and it thawed, and all of a sudden the hard roads turned into mud. So again, they pay off the drivers from New York State. Okay, they bring their oxen back. They go home, and the Massachusetts men take over. Oxen now are replaced with horses and wagons. There you go, oxen. Heroes of the Revolution. So just to recap here, the train was lagging behind, showing the dates of when the train arrived. Knox was in Albany on the 25th of December. The train didn't show up in Albany until January 4th. The train got to Claverack on January 9th. January 16th, they arrived in Springfield, and by January 19th, they were in Framingham. So they're moving again east to get modern-day Route 20, Worcester now, and on into Framingham. And as they unloaded in Framingham, there was John Adams with a smirk on his face. That Knox now temporarily deposited most of the heavier pieces in order to rush the more portable, lighter pieces to Washington and Cambridge. So he's done his job. Now it's getting the pieces slowly but surely to Washington and Cambridge. Okay, and again, Washington at that point was thinking about an over-ice attack on the British from the Dorchester area. Every morning he'd jump up and down on the ice and say, "Tomorrow's the day, boys. We're going to go across Boston, our frozen Boston Harbor." Imagine that, how cold it was, and attack the British. Thankfully, he never did. One thing George Washington was great at was retreating and not attacking, running away and melting into the interior. He had some ghostly escapes in New York, and he lived to fight another day. But anyways, they're coming through Weston. There's marker 24, Weston, marker 25. This is just outside Waltham. Marker 26, the one I spoke of, where my house was in Watertown. And this is the marker itself. It's tilting, but just showing you that here it is. They're arriving. So, it's January 24th, and they've arrived. They're in Cambridge. Washington will take over, and he will arrange the operation to move them to Dorchester Heights, the one remaining hill that overlooks Boston Harbor that could threaten the British fleet. And here's his memorandum. He says, quote, "For expenditures in a journey from the camp around Boston to New York, and from thence with 55 pieces of iron and brass ordnance," so 59, 58, McCullough says. He's saying 55. 1 barrel of flints for muskets, 23 boxes of lead back to camp, including expenses of self, brother, and servant, 520 pounds, 15, 8 3/4. He came in under budget. He had a budget of 1,200 pounds, and he only spent half of it, less than half of it. So now they're in Cambridge. There's an encampment. Washington has taken over. And again, the British have no idea what's going on off the Shawmut Peninsula. Their espionage network was incompetent. And they're surrounded here. So Washington's plotting, what am I going to do? I'm going to get these cannon from Fort Washington. I'm going to now move them to Dorchester Heights through Roxbury. So Fort Washington, I visited there a couple of weeks ago, is across the Charles River. This is what it looks like today. I recommend it if you get a chance to visit it. It just shows you the actual mounds and embrasures where they actually had the cannon mounted. So now they're going to move it through Roxbury and onto the heights in Dorchester. And of course, if you get a chance to visit the Dorchester Heights Monument, if you get a parking space, you're even luckier. But it's a beautiful monument. I can spend the whole day up there, and I did last evacuation day. So the artillery is placed in the heights. It's early March. Wagon loads of birch brush were dragged in wagons and carts to the heights to use as embrasures, bulwarks, and bastions. In other words, they're going to try to form a wall with twigs and logs around the area atop Dorchester Heights, a fortification, a breastworks. And again, the residents of Dorchester and Boston in the days leading up to the gun emplacement, everybody knew this was happening, but the British didn't. Word never got back to the British, but they spent the days collecting trees, chopping down trees, thick branches, anything that they could use to fortify the heights. And they used star, which was basically to muffle the sound of the cannon carts, because sound could travel, and the squeaky wheels of cannons, if it echoed across the harbor, the British might hear that, as they heard the picks of Bunker Hill on the morning of June 17, 1775. So nobody spoke above a whisper. Now they're atop Dorchester Heights. It's March 2nd through the 5th, 1776. They've checkmate. 300 miles they've dragged the cannon, and now they can threaten the British fleet. So it takes about 3 days for them to prepare the cannon installations, and by March 2nd, they were firing at British positions, and they used a feint, a diversion. Washington had a false attack on Cambridge to have the British look the other way in Cambridge when their main attack was to come from the south of Dorchester Heights. So Washington's thinking ahead. Let's trick them to think we're going to attack them from Cambridge, but we're really going to bombard them from the Dorchester Heights. And 2,000 men assisted in disassembling and reassembling the artillery pieces on Dorchester Heights. And by March 4th, everything was in place. So, March 5th, they began firing on British ships, and positions commenced from batteries at Dorchester Heights. People think that the British saw the cannon. Oh no, we'll leave, don't shoot us. It wasn't that, it was the Battle of Dorchester Heights. The ships were firing at Dorchester, and the Dorchester Heights were firing back at the ships. And General Howe decided, we're going to take the Heights tomorrow night, March 6th. And he loaded his men up in the longboats. And even though his commanding officer said, General, we can't afford another victory like we had at Bunker Hill, where they had 1,000 casualties. But sure enough, as they loaded his Marines into these boats, a hurricane, as the British described it, a nor'easter, rocked the boats back and forth. And the British Marines were too seasick to mount a fight. And it was at that point, by March 9th, you know something, Boston? You're not worth the bother. Rabble, we're trapped here. It's just not worth it. We're out of here. And that's when he decided to leave on March 17th with his 7,000 men and his dozens of ships. And Howe told Washington, if you even threaten our embarkation with any artillery, we'll burn Boston to the ground. So Washington said, gentlemen's handshake, we'll let you leave. You know, don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out. But he sent an envoy to convey his plans to General Washington. At that very time in Boston, there was a smallpox outbreak. So Washington sent in men that had already experienced or were somehow immune to smallpox, about 1,500 men, into Boston. And just there was a battle, a furious battle on March 10th. 4 men were killed at Dorchester. A cannonball came from one of the British ships that actually beheaded a man. But they had set a fire, and the British saw it from Boston Harbor and lobbed shells up there, lobbed cannonballs and killed them. But that's what Boston Harbor would have looked like from Dorchester Heights, that image right there. March 11th. So anyways, Washington goes in. It's 1 o'clock. 1,500 troops are into Boston. And again, they're immune to smallpox. And he marches into Boston. The residents who, for all intent and purpose, were imprisoned in Boston were freed. The ships sailed out of Boston Harbor. And that's what led to the British bugging out of Boston on March 17th, 1776. As I said, 59 guns, 55 guns, went 300 miles in 56 days. They made 5.5 miles per day. One gun was lost through the ice and crossing the Mohawk. It wasn't recovered for a century. In fact, there was a feud between competing families that saw the cannon thrown back into the river in 1909, only to be excavated again in 1996. The second made it to Boston. It was displayed at Bunker Hill Monument, then broken up for scrap during World War II, but it was recovered, restored, and then returned to Fort Ticonderoga. No men lost their lives, which was great. In less than 6 beasts of burden, horses and oxen, were lost. Only one major snowstorm, that was a Christmas storm. And had the expedition taken place in the winter of 74, 75, it wouldn't have been successful because it was a warm winter. And it would have gone much smoother had they waited a year, because it was a bitterly cold winter of 76, 77. So 3 questions we have to ask before we close. Why wasn't the expedition given away? Was it a perfect clandestine operation? Was it poor intelligence, or was it ignored intelligence? And I seem to think the latter. The British were so arrogant that word must have gotten back to them, and the Colonsdale's farmers couldn't possibly do that, and they ignored their intelligence. These are my sources. My name's John Horrigan. Thank you so much for listening to the Knox Expedition Evacuation Day. Thanks a lot. I'll throw it back to Marilyn.
John, that was an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you,
Does
Marilyn.
anybody have any questions?
Again, I recommend, if you get a chance to go to Dorchester Heights, or just check out one of the markers. You can look them up online. There's one in Watertown, Framingham, Weston, just to show where he went. There's so much history on Route 20. That's basically the route that was used for settlers to move out of Watertown in the year 1636. So, well, I want to thank you so much.
Yes. And the good news is we have John coming to speak with us again over Zoom, April the 12th, on the history of the Quabbin Reservoir. So we hope you'll all tune in again.
I'd love to have you back. It's the history of Boston drinking water, and we take it for granted. But I'll tell you about all the reservoirs and why Boston was settled. It was due to a little tiny freshwater spring. That's why we're here today. So thank you, everybody. I hope you're be safe, be well, and peace be with you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.